A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Along the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said in reply, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "And who do you say that I am?" Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them, "But the Son of Man must suffer greatly, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and rise after 3 days." He spoke this openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this he turned around, and looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter, and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." He summoned the crowd with his disciples, and said to them, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. We're probably familiar with this Gospel reading, where Jesus takes his disciples to the region of Caesarea Philippi and asks them the famous question, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And then who do you say that I am?" For many of us, that part of the story, and Peter's great reply, is more common, more well-known, more familiar than hearing this middle section of today's Gospel reading, where Jesus rebukes Peter after Peter rebukes Jesus. Because Peter doesn't want anything to happen to his best friend, his pal, his buddy, Jesus. He doesn't want him to have to die and suffer and be rejected. He partially doesn't understand what this means. But Peter's trying to protect this friendship, this life that is Jesus. And so he tries to prevent this from happening. He tries to say, "This is foolish talk, this is silly, this is not going to happen, Lord, not under my watch. You just made me the rock on which you're going to build your church." We hear that in other Gospels, not necessarily St. Mark's, because he's quick and to the point, as we talked about back in Advent, going through this year of St. Mark's Gospel and what to expect. But we know in other Gospels, the other synoptic Gospels, that Jesus gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven here in his Gospel reading. So Peter thinks that his first mission is to protect Jesus from this rejection, from this suffering, from this death, and ultimately from his rising, which they don't understand. So Jesus says something very interesting to Peter after he calls him Satan and an obstacle to him. What he says is this: "You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." Well, what do we human beings think about? Well, is it mathematics? Is it logic? Is it in terms of directions to get from one place to another? What do human beings think about that God doesn't? And I think Jesus means this in the sense of suffering. Because we hear about suffering in the last little bit of today's Gospel reading. But we have a very different perception of suffering than God does. And if you even take a Christian or a Catholic, and most times this is true, when you present them with a challenge, a bad health report, you present them with bad news, or some sort of suffering, they tend to have a different outlook than someone of a different faith, or no faith at all. And that's good. That's progress. But we humans don't fully grasp what it means to suffer. We don't fully grasp suffering in the sense that God does, as Jesus rebukes Peter, and by extension, in a way, all of us. So how should we think of suffering? Well, Jesus lays it out for us here in the latter part of today's gospel reading. Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There it is. He lays it out. That's how to think of suffering like God does. Come after Jesus. Deny himself. Deny ourselves. Take up our cross. Embrace it. Hold on to it. Accept it. And follow Jesus. But that's hard. That's uncomfortable. We know. We know it's tough to suffer. No one wants to do it. No one looks forward to it. No one's comfortable with it. But as Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI once said, the world offers you comfort, but you were not made for comfort. You were made for greatness. And in a sense, I think that Pope Benedict got it right with this thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Because human beings and the world want you to be comfortable. They want you to be happy, temporarily, happy while here on earth, in a comfortable environment all the time, as much as possible. But we weren't necessarily made for that. We were made for greatness. And greatness comes when we suffer. And why do we suffer? Well, I think it's simple. It's because we as Christians, as Catholics, through our baptism, through our profession of faith, have told Jesus that I want to follow you, Lord. I want to become more like you, Lord. I want to do everything that you did. I want to experience everything that you experienced. And for every single one of us, that also entails suffering. Because Jesus suffered. Jesus underwent suffering and ridicule and rejection and mourning and loss. So hopefully whenever we are confronted with something that presents suffering, the loss of a loved one or friend, the loss of a job, being laid off, being fired, a difficult class, an annoying coworker, a bad medical diagnosis, a bad health report. So many other ways that we can suffer. Let's not give in to fear or anxiety or distress or mourning or grief, which all these emotions come normally to us, and we should deal with them correctly. But in the end, let's realize that this is just a cross given to us by God. And as Jesus tells us today, we are to embrace this cross. We're to accept this cross. We're to say yes to this cross. We're to pick up this cross and walk with this cross and follow Jesus. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to be Catholic. Not everything's going to be easy. And we see that in Jesus' life. Not everything's going to be a piece of cake or a walk in the park. And hopefully we know that. And hopefully we're willing and able to accept these crosses given to us by God. To help us to imitate Him. And to be like Him. Because that's what we said we would do by virtue of our baptism. We want to be like Jesus in all things. So we can ultimately make it to heaven to be one with Him. Crosses come up all the time. We're to embrace them, to accept them, to pick them up, and follow Jesus, who will help us to carry our crosses. And we can't take any shortcuts along the way. Because there was once this man who was given this ginormous cross. Cross very difficult to carry, to handle. And he was tasked with walking up the side of a mountain. And on top of the mountain, he would be able to cross over into a threshold, his final destination. He would have succeeded. So he begins the journey with this humongous cross, and he makes it up about a quarter of the way up the mountain. And he realizes that this cross is just too heavy, it's too difficult to bear, can't take it anymore. So he sets the cross down, and he breaks off the bottom of the cross. He cuts off the bottom of the cross. And he continues to walk again. So the cross is significantly lighter. He cut off a couple feet from the bottom of the cross. So he continues walking up the mountain. And he makes it about halfway up the mountain. And it's getting heavy again. It's getting difficult to bear. He needs to take another break. And he cuts off another couple feet from the bottom of the cross. So the cross is significantly shorter than when he started. It's significantly lighter. And significantly easier to bear. So he makes his way up the mountain. And just before reaching the top of the mountain, he can almost see the top, but he realizes, I can't get there. And as I put this thing down again, and he cuts off a little bit from the bottom. And finally, he makes it to the top of the mountain. He begins to walk across, and he sees the threshold. He sees his finishing line. He sees his final destination. But there's this big abyss separating where he's standing on the mountain from where he has to go. There's this great void. There's this great drop-off. So, being smart, he realizes, well, I can set the cross down, the only thing that I have here, to get me across. And it should be long enough to reach from one end, here to the mountain, to my final destination. And then I can walk across like a tightrope. So the man sets the cross down. He's going to slide it over. So he begins to inch the cross forward, off and over the abyss, hoping that it'll latch on to the other side. And he keeps pushing it off. He's starting to run out of wood on his side. But then he realizes that he's just 2 or 3 feet short of stretching the cross from the mountain where he is to his final destination. It's going to be impossible to connect the two sides and get to his final destination. It's too far to jump, and there's nothing else he can do. You see, he tried to cut corners, take shortcuts, and lighten the load and the burden of his cross. And that was the issue. My brothers and sisters, as Jesus commands us today, let's take up our crosses in life, whatever it might be, whether it be addiction, abuse, ridicule, rejection, loneliness, fear, anxiety, hopelessness, despair, grief, financial struggles, whatever physical ailments, health diagnosis, whatever our cross might be in life. We've all experienced a lot of crosses in life. Maybe we're experiencing a tough cross right now. And I'm sure we can all predict that there will be another cross, or many more, waiting for us in the future. But just as Jesus, who we have vowed to follow and to want to be like and emulate him in his sufferings, just as he went through the darkest of the darks, the terrible day on Good Friday, we know that there was an Easter Sunday right after. But in the midst of all of our suffering, all of our crosses will lead to an Easter Sunday eventually. We don't know when that'll be. It might not be 3 days later like it was for Jesus. I'm sure we've all experienced that with this current pandemic. That cross wasn't over in 3 days. But let's have hope. Even if the cross does not lead to an Easter Sunday in this life, it will in the life to come. As long as we can get to our final destination without cutting corners, we're trying to lighten the burden and load of our crosses. Because we're given these specific crosses for a reason. And we've asked for them ourselves. Because by nature of our baptism, we as Christians and as Catholics have vowed, Jesus, I want to follow you. What does it mean to follow you? And he says it right here at the end of today's gospel reading. And I want to leave you with this. Jesus says to Simon Peter and his disciples the crowds, and by extension, all of us here today. Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it.